On the evening of 26th of August 1978 in New Delhi, teenage siblings Sanjay and Geeta Chopra left their home near Daula Kwan for All India Radio's Yuva Vani program and vanished before they could reach the studio. They were abducted by two men using a stolen Fiat with fake plates, a crime that ended with both siblings found murdered on the Delhi Ridge near Buddha Jayanti Park. The suspects were identified as Kuljit Ranga Singh and Jasbir Bila Singh, whose eventual capture, trial, and 1982 executions would become one of the capital's most closely watched criminal sagas. It began as an ordinary Saturday plan in a city where families trusted familiar routes and routines, with two teenagers heading to a youth radio program they were excited to attend. The Chopras lived near Daula Kwan, a well-known junction on Delhi's grid, and All India Radio on Sansad Marg was a straightforward destination that should have taken less than an hour in evening traffic. Sanjay and Geeta had a pickup time arranged with their father, Captain M.M. Chopra of the Indian Navy, which made the evening feel anchored and safe. They left home around 6:15 p.m., the kind of detail families remember because it ties an ordinary goodbye to a clock that later everyone consults. At first, it looked like a normal evening, the kind where plans click into place and voices at the radio studio become the proud punctuation of a weekend. But the siblings never signed in at All India Radio, a small omission that became the first signal that the night had diverged from its expected path. A mustard-colored Fiat with false number plates pulled into their story, and once its doors shut, the car became the setting and the confinement. Witnesses along the route would later recall a struggle inside, with attempts by passers-by to intervene that fell just short as the car moved ahead. The police didn't know it yet, but the clue they needed was already out there. An eyewitness note of a license plate garbled by a single error, a human slip that blunted an urgent lead in a city of many moving parts. In a case that would eventually hinge on timing, that misstep showed how fragile the first hours of any investigation can be. Captain Chopra went to the AIR building when he realized the children had not arrived, an action that changed worry into evidence by confirming their absence at the most expected location. That discovery fed into the initial missing report, turning a family's concern into institutional attention, phone calls, watch orders, and a widening net that still had too few threads. Delhi in the late 1970s carried a mix of bustle and blind spots, with long stretches that felt public by day and unobserved at night. The Ridge, in particular, was both a landmark and a shadowed margin, a place where the city's greenery was thick enough to muffle sound and sightlines. By the time the family and police were aligning clocks and logs, the stolen car had already redirected toward the Ridge, where the night seemed to absorb movements without return. That path would soon be marked by recovery rather than rescue, drawing the first clear line between hope and the facts that followed. It was a case that started with silence. No show at the studio, no quick explanation, no reliable plate number, and gathered momentum as small fragments began to cohere. The early anxiety on the family's side was matched by growing public concern as word spread that two teenagers had not made it to a well-known and trusted institution in the heart of the city. Story took shape quickly because the details were simple and terrible. A set time, a familiar route, and the sudden insertion of a car that wasn't theirs. The city felt the breach because it could imagine the path, the buildings, and the turnings that should have been unremarkable. Public unease gathered like a current, moving from neighborhoods into newsrooms, where reporters tracked the missing teens with the cadence of a city that sensed more than a delay. It didn't take long for that unease to turn into outrage once the first confirmations arrived from the Ridge. The landscape of the case, even in its earliest telling, was already a map of Delhi's contradictions. Open roads and hidden pockets, crowds and isolation, vigilance and the chance for a car door to shut at the wrong moment. The distance from Daulaquan to the ridge wasn't great, but in those minutes, the city learned how far an ordinary evening could be pushed. By the end of that first weekend, the narrative had shifted from what might still be a misunderstanding to what the city suspected was worse. The rhythm of normal life had been interrupted, and in its place stood a story that felt both specific to one family and uncomfortably universal. The police would soon formalize the threads. Car, route, time, but the emotional story was already established. Two teenagers, one radio program, and a turn that refused to correct itself overnight. In the days to come, the city's attention would pivot from the question of where they were to the more painful certainty of where they had been found. A cattle grazer on the Delhi Ridge came across what he should never have had to find. And that discovery brought uniformed officers and crime branch specialists into a quiet corridor of trees and brush. The bodies were identified within days, a step that turned private fear into public mourning and fixed the timeline for investigators and courts alike. The ridge did not give up much beyond the obvious, because it rarely does, but it held enough to support the essential truth the city could already feel. The area near Buddha Jayanti Park became a point on the map that reporters would reference and families would avoid because it bore the weight of an ending. Early reports mentioned abduction and assault, and the legal record later preserved a difficult nuance. The accused initially admitted sexual assault and then retracted, and forensic tools of the time failed to close the loop with certainty. What never blurred was the fatal violence, which was clear enough to sustain the gravest charges and to carry the case through appeals without dilution. The car was the second scene, a mobile space that investigators could reconstruct through vehicle records and witness recollections, including the sighting of a mustard-colored Fiat with passengers in distress. It had been stolen earlier and fitted with false plates, a preparation that suggested deliberation rather than impulse. Along the route, there were small human attempts to intervene that became a quiet testament to how close a recovery had come, and how quickly moving traffic can wash away chances. One witness offered a plate that landed imperfectly in police logs, a single character off, which in a city the size of Delhi was enough to widen the search rather than narrow it. Investigators followed the evidence that could be followed: vehicle traces, bystander accounts, matching of physical marks, while acknowledging that the ridge was never a cooperative witness. The medical findings returned with the clarity required on cause of death, but not all the surrounding questions would be resolved in a way that satisfied every headline. Inside the city, the reaction was immediate and loud, with protests led by students and public figures who demanded speed, certainty, and the harshest outcomes available under law. The case had turned, in days, from a missing person notice into a referendum on urban safety and the reach of a justice system under pressure. It was also a test for policing. Could the trail built from a misreported plate, a stolen car, and a violent end be turned into a straight line that led to two names and nowhere else? The answer, in time, would be yes, but only after a mistake by the suspects made the search less about technique and more about opportunity. For the Chopra family, the scene on the ridge was a boundary that the story could not cross back over, a place where hope stopped and procedure began. Formal identification and the cascade of steps that follow. Statements, autopsy, coordination, were the mechanics of a process that, by necessity, kept moving. The press covered those movements with an intensity that fit the scale of public emotion, framing the ridge not just as a crime scene, but as a symbol of how the city could lose track of its own children. That framing mattered because it fixed the stakes for the investigation and shaped how the court's eventual rulings would be read. If the first act of the case was about an evening plan collapsing in transit, the second act was about the hard floor of reality, where evidence and identification write their own unambiguous sentences. The names of the suspects were not widely known yet, But the shape of what had happened was already stable in the public mind. The question hanging over the case was now simple and relentless. Who had taken the siblings, and how quickly could the trail be turned from general suspicion into specific arrests? Delhi was no longer content to wait for answers to arrive. It expected them to be taken. 2 men boarded a Delhi-bound train near Agra and made a mistake that ended their run, stepping into a compartment reserved for military personnel where uniforms and protocol were not optional. On 8th of September 1978, roughly 2 weeks after the crime, Army Jawans confronted the pair, and a Lance Naik recognized their faces from newspaper coverage. The recognition bridged the gap between public outrage and operational success, turning a widely circulated photograph into a decisive moment of identification. The men, Kuljit Ranga Singh and Jasbir Bila Singh, were subdued and handed over at New Delhi railway station to Inspector V.P. Gupta, which opened the door to formal interrogations and evidence collection. In their belongings, a sword was recovered, and medical examinations noted injuries consistent with recent fights. Details that prosecutors would later use to buttress a case already supported by the car, the route, and the witnesses. Investigators secured hair and blood samples and fingerprints, the kind of routine yet critical documentation that transforms suspicion into charge sheets. The police didn't know it at the start, but boarding a military compartment had given them the break they had been building toward, a turn that made all the difference in a city with too many places to disappear. When the suspects were brought into custody, the narrative shifted again, from search to preparation, from open questions to a closed circuit of charges and hearings. As the case moved into courtrooms, the focus narrowed to what could be proved and what must be punished, a legal cadence that left little room for ambiguity on the central facts. The Delhi High Court confirmed death sentences on 16th of November 1979, noting the cold-blooded nature of the murders and rejecting lesser penalties as inadequate to the crime. On 8 December 1980, the Supreme Court dismissed the appeals with a bench led by Chief Justice Y.V. Chandrachud, affirming both conviction and sentence in terms that reflected the calculated savagery of the acts. Appeals and mercy petitions ended without reprieve, setting the path toward Tihar jail and the executions in 1982. Outside the courts, the case continued to act as a mirror for Delhi's anxieties, not just about one night, but about the reliability of ordinary routines in a large and growing city. Media reports revisited the route, the ridge, and the train, turning each into a chapter that audiences could follow and remember. The significance of the case also rested in how it tied together the city's circulatory system, roads, parks, trains, and showed how each could be part of a story that began with movement and ended with a stoppage. That linkage helped explain why the case never quite faded, even after the legal file had been closed by the most final of sentences. Public reaction had started as grief and anger and solidified into expectation, and the judiciary's stark language met that expectation with a clarity that was rare and notable. The executions did not restore what had been lost, but they formed the last page of a story the city had insisted be completed. Even decades later, the case lived on in retellings, television anthologies, and streaming. Projects that revisit Tihar and the capital's most discussed crimes, ensuring that the names remained in circulation for reasons beyond notoriety. These retellings framed the investigation's luck and persistence, and they preserved the victim's story in the center of the narrative. The hunt, in the end, turned on a miscalculation by the suspects and a moment of attentiveness by a soldier who had seen their faces in print, a collision of recklessness and vigilance. It was a reminder that in cases like this, information shared widely can be as powerful as a formal lead, especially when the city is already watching. The judgments read with unusual firmness, presenting a view that the murders were deliberate, brutal, and undeserving of any sentence less than death. The legal journey from the Sessions Court to the Delhi High Court and then to the Supreme Court, was swift by the standards of the era, reflecting both the strength of the case and the public demand for closure. The executions in 1982 closed the official narrative, even as the city continued to revisit the story as a measure of its own vulnerability and its capacity for response. Every retelling emphasized the straightforward cruelty of the act and the equally straightforward duty of the system to answer it. Why this case stayed prominent had as much to do with its simplicity as with its horror. A planned evening, a stolen car, a wooded ridge, a train mistake, and finality in Tihar. Each element was legible to a broad audience, and that legibility turned into permanence. The case also raised questions that never fully left Delhi's conversation about safety. How public spaces are monitored, how quickly tips are verified, and how ordinary movement can be defended without paranoia. The misrecorded plate became a small parable about precision under pressure, a lesson repeated in training rooms and columns alike. For the Chopra family, the story was never about the system, but about two lives that were not defined by their ending, even if the public record must return to that ending to make sense of the rest. The narrative continued to be retold with care to avoid sensationalism, a balance that respected the victims while also acknowledging the case's influence on public memory. Over time, the case helped define how Delhi thought about justice in the context of violent crime, anchoring debates about deterrence in a concrete example with clear judicial language. The Supreme Court's affirmation on 8 December 1980 was often cited as an articulation of that line, one that insisted on the weight of deliberate violence in sentencing. In the cultural sphere, references to the case appeared in pieces that explored the operations of Tihar jail and the stories that moved through its gates, including accounts grouped under the banner of Black Warrant. These accounts connected the courtroom to the prison yard, putting a frame around the last steps of a process that had consumed public attention from the start. The city's memory tends to keep a short list of cases that shaped its sense of self and its expectations of institutions, and the Rangabilla case found a place on that list because it touched so many everyday points. From Daula Kwan to Sansad Marg to the Ridge and a train near Agra, the geography felt familiar even to those who had never been there. It was a case that started with silence and ended with a verdict no one questioned in its severity, a path that made sense to a public that had run out of patience for ambiguity. In the end, the narrative settled where it had to, with names, dates, places, and a sequence that connected them without gaps large enough to invite doubt. The story kept its hold because it was easy to imagine and impossible to accept, and because it asked a city to look closely at how it protected the most ordinary of journeys. The legal clarity, from the High Court's confirmation in 1979 to the Supreme Court's dismissal in 1980 and the executions thereafter, provided a hard edge that matched the demand for answers. In remembering Sanjay and Geeta, Delhi remembered a promise that public space should not turn against its users without consequence, and that vigilance can be taught, learned, and mobilized. The case's continued presence in media, from articles to anthology shows and prison histories, ensured that the memory did not thin with time. The police didn't know it at the start, but the clue they had been searching for was waiting in a train compartment where two fugitives trusted luck over judgment, and where attention did the rest. It was a case that began with a missing arrival at All India Radio and ended with a final count in Tihar jail, a line of events that still reads with the blunt coherence of hard truth.